And you might also want to think about a second question, which is how you want things to be instead. Because when we're thinking about coaching, it's quite important to think about how you want things to be rather than how you want them not to be, because that helps us focus towards a goal rather than away from it. So quite often we just say, I don't want to be stressed, rather than thinking about how we might want to be instead. So if you just have a think about those two questions for a moment, and then what we'll do is try and facilitate the share, particularly to see what people's thoughts are about what they want to get out of tonight. So I know that I'm answering the questions that you're here for. Are you able to help with facilitating that, Ben? For the
no problem. I'm going to pop 2 minutes on the clock just so people can have a think about that now. Yeah, so I'll give you all 2 minutes, get some stuff written down, and then I'll be grabbing you on for a bit of share.
Can you see yourself? Can you see yourself there? Can you see me in the background? Yes or no? Yes.
It's in the background.
So what do I want? How do I want?
So 60 seconds for that. Feel free to note things down on your phone if you don't want to write them down, whatever you want. About 30 seconds. Do you want me to go first, Nicola?
Yeah, so I can't see the share tab while I've got this screen up as well. So I can't see what anybody else.
If anybody does want to share, if you either just put your hand up or just put in the chat share. Whilst we're waiting to see if anybody's chat does come up, I'll go first. So the reason I'm interested in this is from a coaching perspective and how I can support others as well as myself. So understanding what I go through at times and what other people could be going through in a bigger problem. And then I think going forwards, how I would like things to be is to be able to explain sort of strategies for coping in a better way. Right, Nicola? Anybody? Is that okay?
Thank you. No, that's really helpful, because I said I can then tailor what I'm saying, hopefully, to address those questions. So what I had in mind for what I was going to cover today is kind of three particular kind of areas. So I suppose coming from a background as a doctor, I always thought it was quite interesting to think about what's actually happening kind of in your brain when these things are going on, a bit like kind of looking under the bonnet of the car and thinking about, well, what is happening, so that we can know what there is to change. So this presentation kind of looks at a few different sort of models about stress, but is also kind of coming from my perspective of thinking about the actual kind of brain as an organ as well, and thinking about why it's really important then to manage that brain as an organ. So just again, as we're thinking about our body and trying to get our body into peak fitness, what are we doing kind of with our brain to make that work as well as it can? What can we do to get the best out of it? And then hopefully from the presentation to come away with today, a few ideas of things that you could put into practice straight away as part of a plan. Again, a bit like you might do with your fitness, of where are you going to begin with this? So beginning with an introduction to your brain. So this is your brain sliced in half down the middle. This would be your right side of the brain. This bit is your prefrontal cortex. So it's kind of the bits right at the front of your brain. And this I'm going to refer to as our control center for today. So this is going to be something that we'll come back to as being really quite important when we're thinking about stress and overwhelm. And it's sort of funny, it's the place where you might get your headaches or be rubbing your head when you're getting kind of stressed and tense, where we get our forehead wrinkles. But this is kind of a really important place, kind of right inside the brain when we're getting stressed. So coming back to then when we're growing a brain, it's a bit like when we're planting a seed. There are things that the brain needs when you're a little baby kind of in the womb and growing up, and instead of the sunlight and the water and the nutrients from the soil, we're given kind of love, learning, food, safety, and that's what helps the brain develop in the right way. And a really useful concept that is going around quite a lot in the field about managing trauma, and particularly those who might have had quite traumatic events in childhood, or thinking about things like post-traumatic stress, is thinking about how the brain develops in three parts when it's growing. So we begin with our most basic bits of the brain, and that's our hindbrain, kind of right at the back, our brain stem. And that part of the brain basically keeps us alive. It's the bit that does our heart rate and our breathing. And when we're put into a coma, that's the bit that's sort of still going to kind of make us be alive. And you might see on kind of ER when they decide kind of whether somebody might be brain dead or not, is that part of the brain stem still functioning? Then the next bit is our midbrain, which we can call our emotions brain or our feelings brain. And that's sort of the next bit to develop. And in there, we've got bits like our hippocampus and parts like that, which are involved with things like memory making. We've got our insula in there, which helps kind of connect body sensations into our thinking brain. So, for example, when we're interpreting an emotion, people might have seen in kind of other programs that our body basically does the same thing, whether we're kind of nervous or excited. Our heart rate goes up, we have sensations in our tummy, we start breathing faster, but we use other information in our brain to interpret that. So we decide that we're nervous rather than excited. So it's all about kind of the way we label just what's going on in our body. It's the same kind of sensation. It's our brain that kind of tells us which one it is that we're experiencing. And then the most sophisticated part that's developed kind of most latterly is our thinking brain, or our cortex. And this, we think, is probably still developing kind of into our early 20s. And so this part is doing the more sophisticated functions, and particularly those bits at the front of it, where we're doing quite complex things like planning out, making decisions, so coordinating lots of bits of information. And so coming back, there we are kind of right in the front of that most sophisticated bit of brain, in the prefrontal cortex, in the control center. Now, this bit is thought to be very energy hungry, and we think that probably it works on full pelt for about 20 minutes before it starts to kind of get quite exhausted. And this is why, if you're trying to study or do something quite mentally challenging, it can be really difficult to kind of keep going with that for long periods of time, and we often need to take a break with that. Although I have never found kind of any particular scientific studies that back this up, I've kind of also read it being described as we can make about 200 decisions in a day with this bit of our brain. So I just had to put the caveat that I can't find that research, but it makes kind of sense in a way, and was kind of described as why some kind of high-flying people like Obama or Mark Zuckerberg try to not even make decisions about what outfits they're going to wear every day. They kind of like save those decisions for like the most complex things. So whether that's kind of an urban myth, I don't know, but because decisions involve so much kind of managing of information outside and inside the mind, they're kind of using up quite a lot of that energy that's going on. So it's just thinking that this is a part of the brain that is quite kind of limited in its resource. So in this, it kind of manages information that's coming from outside of ourselves, as well as inside of ourselves. So outside, we're going to be using our senses, so seeing, hearing, tasting, our proprioception that's going on. All of that information from outside kind of coming in through our other organs, going through our brain, be interpreted, and then sending that information to be coordinated to make decisions there. So, think of like all of what is going on kind of around you at any one time, and what has to kind of come in. It's got to not only see what's there, but also kind of go kind of in and out with other bits of the brain, like memory, to decide, does this connect with some other sort of bad memory that's going on? Have I been in this situation before? Really quite complex thinking that's happening. And then it's also combining that with kind of other thoughts that might be coming from inside of the brain, as well as other sensations that are coming up from the body. So we might be feeling kind of other sensations like pain and hunger, and all of those are kind of coming into this bit of the brain and trying to be managed. So already just talking about it, you're feeling quite exhausted with thinking about what it's got to cope with and do on a regular basis. But is all of this kind of bad? Well, it isn't. So this stress curve is quite often cited and was done by some people called Yerkes and Dodson. So we think about our kind of performance against our kind of arousal or stress level. And that actually, if we've got absolutely no stress or nothing that's going to kind of get us kind of going, we're actually kind of might be asleep, less alert, not kind of concentrating as much. And actually, survival wise, that could put us at risk if you're not kind of there ready for kind of managing things that are going on in the environment. But too much stress and you can end up distressed and then not being able to perform and cope with what's going on. So there is this optimum and this kind of bit in the middle that's described as eustress, which is a kind of a good stress. So our kind of aim might be to be somewhere in that middle. I suppose often we're kind of slipping kind of from side to side, and we know that sometimes we do things to try and make ourselves a little bit more stressed or pumped up to kind of perform in a situation. I mean, I know myself, sometimes you'll create things like deadlines or by things like we're doing in sport, making yourself more accountable to others or putting yourself out there to share something kind of can then increase your performance at it. Think again of sports people getting themselves a little bit pumped up before an event, because if they were like right down at that other end of the stress curve, they just wouldn't be performing as well as they could do. So trying to get kind of in that peak in theory is kind of a good thing. And stress kind of often comes where there's a kind of a difference between reality and expectation. We kind of hope for things to be one way and they're kind of a little bit more demanding than we thought. But again, this can be a good thing. So we have kind of our kind of comfort zone, and then around that, a kind of a zone that's described as our zone of kind of proximal development, and then outside of that a kind of a panic zone. But if you can be slightly stretched in in what's kind of a reasonable way for you. We think that this kind of might help make brain connections, and people might have heard of the phrases of things like the neurons that like wire together, fire together. So, you know, when we're kind of learning something new, we're having to put ourselves under a bit of stress to kind of push ourselves that little bit, but do that too much and you end up in the panic zone and you're not learning. And I'm sure kind of all of us have ended up kind of during this pandemic learning things that we didn't know before, or having to kind of acquire skills that we weren't doing. I mean, I know things like having to use webinars and conference calling and things was not something I did on a daily basis, and all of a sudden you're having to learn quite a lot of new technology very, very quickly. I think people kind of getting used to, you know, how you're going to go shopping in a different way and all the other ways that we're kind of dealing with things. So some of those things can be good for us. And there is quite a lot of talk about things like post-traumatic growth. So if people are kind of able to be resilient enough after a trauma, there can then be a growth of that person and a development. But it's about pacing that and kind of what sort of position the person might have been in before. So again, stress can be a good thing. It's just how do you try and manage that to get it the right amount. And again, I suppose using the analogy of exercise and things like that, you know, if we were starting there with the 16k kettlebell straight away, that wouldn't be a good thing. We probably kind of end up with an injury, kind of in my case. But like building up to something helps you to grow that muscle in that way. So then just coming on to another model that I think is really quite helpful. I don't know whether people may or may not have seen this, called the stress bucket. So this is the idea of thinking about stress being a bit like a bucket, and the stresses that you're experiencing in your everyday life. So these may be things that, you know, potentially help you kind of grow, but they're all things that are all a little bit pushed out of your comfort zone and things that you have to kind of deal with, put you under a little bit of pressure. They're being poured into the bucket by the watering can, and then our kind of coping are the holes at the bottom of the watering can. So in a good place, we'd have kind of our coping abilities with enough holes in the bottom of the watering can that as we're pouring the stresses in, the water's coming out. However, if we have too much stress that's being poured in the bucket, or not enough holes in the bottom, it spills over and we become kind of overwhelmed with that. And you know, we use this quite a bit in patients in terms of mental health as well, because often with different mental health conditions, they may have lower coping abilities because perhaps they're experiencing an episode of depression or anxiety at that time. So it's like they've got fewer holes in that bucket. So they might have previously coped with the amount of water that was being poured in before, but now can't. Or for, you know, us going through an unprecedented time, we may have previously had coping abilities, but we're just having so much that's being poured in the bucket. At some point, it's coming over the top. Then thinking about our stress reactions of what happens then in the body, to think about, well, why else do we want to manage stress? Well, there are things that happen acutely, so straight away in that moment, and then there are things that happen if we keep being under stress for a long period of time. And these are things that are natural in our body, and it's a good thing because we're designed like that to keep ourselves safe. So if we didn't have all these threat response systems, we wouldn't be able to be keeping ourselves safe. And it's been we think like that since kind of cave people times, that you know, if a tiger is coming towards us, we have things like our amygdala in the brain that recognizes that as a threat, sends a signal down to our adrenal glands, sets off our sympathetic nervous system. We start producing that adrenaline. It sets off our heart rate, it increases our breathing rate and our lung capacity, and that puts us in a position where we could fight the tiger or run away. So we're kind of all pumped and primed and kind of ready to be in that active state. And a hormone called cortisol is also produced from that area as well. And again, that's a good thing if a tiger's about to attack you, because that can set off a few other chain reactions of other substances in the body that are ready for, if that tiger bit into you and caused an injury, you're ready to fight and heal your body with those various things like cytokines and stuff that go off. But as we'll come on to, kind of having that chronically isn't a good thing. Another response that sometimes happens is that instead of your sympathetic system going off and getting you all pumped up, your parasympathetic nervous system takes over, and that slows your heart rate down, reduces your muscle tone, and you freeze or sometimes collapse and faint. And we think that this might be because if you're not able to kind of fight or run away, then another survival tactic was to kind of act like you're dead, and then potentially with the tiger kind of run away. But again, we know that sometimes people have these responses in a very stressful situation. You know, you might have been there yourselves of, I think, well, I didn't do anything about it, I just froze and I couldn't move. So they're not unusual kind of acute reactions that people might have in very stressful situations. But then chronically, if you're having that kind of emitting the cortisol kind of all of the time, that can have some quite damaging effects on your body. So in your brain, particularly a lot of studies that has a look at developing children who were under a lot of stress from a lot of adverse childhood experiences, the cortisol actually affected bits of the brain that were involved in things like retaining memories, and affected the area of the amygdala that detects threat responses as well, to make that kind of bigger. So you're kind of more poised for kind of being ready to detect more threat that's going on, and then being able to kind of concentrate and things like that becomes worse. The good news is, kind of once people kind of are released from that kind of stress and threat, particularly if it's kind of happening as they're kind of older, we think that reverses. But for children who've been under kind of really damaging kind of situations when they were younger, they can often still have kind of some issues because it was the developing brain that had occurred in kind of earlier on. Then in your body, having a lot of cortisol kind of all of the time can again make your body ready to be adapting for that stressful response. So I don't know if people have heard of the condition Cushing syndrome, where your body as a disease produces too much cortisol. But when we produce it kind of through stress, people can sometimes find that we collect particularly abdominal fat, or kind of across your neck in what's described as a buffalo hump. You can get thinning of the skin, and then sometimes people will experience other flare-ups of other, particularly things like skin conditions, because of these chain reactions that are the body really trying to kind of fight off other threats that we would have had in more primitive times. And then of course there's the kind of effects on our kind of relationships and our lives, of what it's like to be kind of under stress all of the time. So people then might be experiencing relationship breakdown, difficulties managing their work, managing their home life. So I suppose this is all to kind of say, well, you know, what is my reason why for kind of wanting to do something different about it? These are kind of good reason for doing that. So avoiding situations where you don't want to be exposing your body, where you can, to kind of chronic stress. What else can you be doing to think about making changes for that? So what is the kind of like the first thing that you might be able to do? And I suppose like anything, it's like recognizing when it's happening. So if we think about that as kind of our our thoughts, our emotions, our physical sensations and behaviours that we get into. It's different for everybody, and we're probably better at noticing it in people that we live with, aren't we, Ollie? Than we might do even in ourselves. And kind of picking up on those. So I suppose when we're thinking about, how do we help other people as well, I guess it's not pointing it out at the moment that they're really stressed and overwhelmed and displaying this, but how do you kind of let them know that actually I've noticed that when you start doing this, it might be a sign that you're a bit more stressed. How can I help you out with this? So types of examples that could happen could be like in your thoughts, things like I'm useless, I can't do this is too hard. So I think somebody had touched on kind of that kind of negative thinking kind of spiral. So recognizing that you're having some negative thoughts is kind of like, I suppose, the first stage to being able to kind of do anything with that. Then emotions that might be experienced, again, this can be wide ranging for different people. So for some it might be quite common that they go into anger as an emotion. For others it could be sadness. For some it could be feelings of self-loathing. For others, frustration. Really kind of different and kind of personal to each other. Then there might be different physical sensations that people get. So some people are just kind of overwhelmed by fatigue when they're getting really stressed and might want to kind of just rest, lie on the sofa, can't actually do anything. Others are quite kind of hyperactive and can't kind of sit still and on the go all the time. People might be experiencing things like feeling sick or getting palpitations or difficulty catching their breath or muscle tension, headaches. Noticing kind of what is that like in a pattern kind of for you. And then the behaviours that we show, again, very, very different for different people. For some, they'll notice that they're shouting. For some, they're noticing that they're just not talking. It might be, banging objects. It might be just not feeling like they can't make decisions at all, or for others making very rash decisions and coming out with things kind of quickly. So I thought at this point we might just kind of pause again for a couple of minutes then to have a think about on our sheets, for people to think about them and personally, what do they recognise when they're getting a bit overwhelmed? What might be the thoughts they have, the emotions they experience, sensations they feel in their body, and any things that they do differently. And I mean, you might feel that this is a bit personal for you to want to share. So by no means does anybody have to, but people do want to but just take this moment to sort of have a couple of minutes to think about it and jot it down.
Yep, I'll pop a timer on for, I think this one will take a bit long, about 3 minutes. I'll pop a timer on 3 minutes. And I'll stick a little bit of music on. So about 90 seconds. Either get some things written down, fill a sheet in, or even pop it in your phones, whatever you've got at hand. Make sure you're having a good think about this. Like Nicholas said, you don't have to share any. It's just for your benefit. Last 30 seconds. Right, Nicola, would you like me to share first?
Oh, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, see if we can get any more. So for me, I definitely become sort of an agitated, all over the place person with irrational thinking, and just think that I need to get everything done all at once. And yeah, irrational for me is definitely a behavior, and agitated is a physical sensation.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else like to share? Just put your hand up or just pop a comment in. Nope.
No, thank you for sharing that, because I think that did really highlight that point of like how different and individual it is for people personally, but also that we can experience that a range of different things ourselves as well. But quite often there are a few things that are themes and patterns. And I suppose even John said, you know, he didn't recognise kind of feeling stressed in himself as well. So I suppose it's just noticing that everybody is different, and we might think, oh, you know, why doesn't that person feel the same way as I do? We're all in this experience together. Why are they getting kind of agitated, and somebody else is feeling like, you know, Phil, you were saying like feeling sadness, and yet you're having the same experience as it. So just recognizing it can be really different, really personal. So, you know, helping to kind of, if somebody is saying they're feeling stressed, getting them to talk about, well, how do you feel, rather than assuming that it might be the same way that you experience feeling stressed, because we use it as a kind of word, but the emotions we experience, the thoughts we have, the physical sensations and the behaviors we do are all really, really different. It isn't the same. Stress isn't the same for everybody. So in terms of then understanding what are the triggers for you, so we kind of like use this word quite a lot in kind of like mental health services, but thinking like what sets off your stress, and why is that important? So some of the things people talk then about what are the things we can control and what are the things we can't control. So actually it was Stephen Covey who wrote the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I think, who did the circles of, in the middle, your circle of control, then around it you've got a circle of influence, and then outside of that, things that are completely outside of your control. So the only things that you can control are your own thoughts and your own behaviours. In your circle of influence, you might be able to influence other people's thoughts and behaviors and some of the things around you, but you can't control them. You know, whatever I want to do, I can't make my children do things, or you, or that kind of, I can't do that. You know, the only person I can have any control over kind of is myself, and even myself, it's only really like my thoughts and my actions. There are still some things that might be going on in me that I can't do anything about. So recognizing, is this something I can do anything about, or is it anything I can influence and try to do something about, or is it just something I cannot? And that might help you to think about where to focus your energies when you're having your worries, because perhaps it's better to think, well, what are those things I could do something about here, and act upon them first, because you're going to have the biggest changes where you've got the biggest kind of leverage of control, I suppose, and then the smallest changes of things that you can't really do kind of much about. So kind of worrying too much about what Donald Trump has said, whereas he, you know, I can't control Donald Trump. So no, but knowing your triggers. So I suppose thinking about that bucket again, when is there too much that's going in, and when have you got reduced capacity to deal with it? When have you, like, your holes got smaller or kind of disappeared? So these are kind of some ideas of particular things that might go off. And again, people are different to each other. Some will be more sensitive to some things than others. So some of these are on here are things that particularly I will find as triggers. And because when we thought about our brains and kind of managing that information, I can kind of see why. So things like conflict, and that can be conflict with another person, but it can also be when other things just aren't right, kind of in a situation, kind of seeing injustices or things that are going on. Sensory overload. Again, people have got different levels of tolerance and for different senses as well. But think about, again, what else is kind of going on around us. Noise. It can be volume of noise, the type of noise that's going on, clutter that's kind of happening around, because again, our senses are picking up on that. For other people, that might not be kind of an issue. Multiple kind of distractions that are going on. So again, when our brain is kind of there focusing and trying to make decisions and process all of this information, and then we have a distraction that happens, we know it takes like quite a long time to then get back onto that original train of thought. And again, different bits of literature have said different timings, but we think it's kind of certainly over 5 minutes before you're kind of fully back kind of on task again. So if you think about kind of all of the things that might be happening and kind of distracting you through the day, when you've got messages kind of going off, or somebody coming in and talking to you, and an email pops up, it's really, really difficult to focus on the thing that your brain was trying to process. So very, very quickly, it's kind of going, I'm struggling to manage all of this information. Lots of complex decisions. So there will be times in our lives where we have to make kind of more difficult decisions than others, and we know that can be a really stressful time, because you're having to kind of again think about balancing lots of information, the impact of that on other people. So doing that kind of on a regular basis can be hard, but also going through periods of our life where we might have to do kind of more of that could end up kind of be more stressful. Unfairness and comparison. So again, fascinatingly, there's kind of the bits of your brain that kind of judge this as well. And again, I suppose it's natural as a survival response, isn't it, that we kind of might want to be thinking about where we compare with others in the hierarchy. But again, think of all the things that happen kind of in our daily lives where we're kind of judging ourselves against other people, and do we perceive kind of whether we've kind of got a kind of good deal about things, or we're kind of better off, worse off, not being treated kind of in the same way. And that can be, again, quite a difficult thing for our brain, another stressor that's happening. Thoughts about the past and anxieties about the future. So again, I think when we were talking about things that you can and can't control, so you know that our kind of memories from the past we can't actually control and do anything about, because that's kind of already happened. And our worries about the future we can't actually do anything about, because we don't know really actually what's going to happen in the future. So we kind of then in the middle, kind of with the present. The present is kind of like the only thing that we probably have got control over. I mean, I know you can do some planning for the future, but again, the amount of control you have, especially the further away it is, the harder it is to kind of control that outcome. So again, we do often kind of in our heads spend that time ruminating about what has already happened, thinking about, well, could this happen, could that happen? So they're all, again, bits of information that our brain is having to manage, and could be more things to add to the bucket that perhaps you can't cope with at a particular time.
I think nobody had planned for the current situation with coronavirus, had they? So any future planning really could be blown out the water. So
yeah, that's it. So kind of, things that you thought that you might have been worried about, that could be off your radar. So I'm not saying don't think about it at all, but just it's thinking about in proportion where are we spending our kind of thought time and energy, and then thinking about kind of like the holes in the bucket. So all sorts of things again might affect our capacity. Illness, both so people experiencing mental illness, but also physical illness. We know when we even got a bit of a cold, it can be much harder for us to kind of think through things, and sometimes it's like, do you need to be making that complex decision on that day when you're really not feeling that well? Things like lack of sleep, or when we know that we've not been kind of eating kind of in a healthy way, so perhaps you're either kind of experiencing hunger, or you're ending up kind of, because you've been stressed, having things like lots more kind of sugar, kind of alcohol, and you're having kind of crashes of highs and lows. So again, kind of our brain kind of using the energy resources that we have, it kind of needs to have some quite instant access energy, but if we're having kind of lots of crashes, highs and lows that are going on, again, it can be quite hard for it to focus. We've all sort of been there when it's sort of running out of energy, and so we think, okay, we'll have a quick chocolate bar to kind of focus again, but then it runs out again. So trying to keep those kind of steady states, but I think we a lot of kind of other bits of nutrition like B vitamins and things can be quite helpful in terms of affecting how your neurons are working. So having balanced diets to be able to get our brains functioning as well as they can be. Things like hormonal changes. So there are times of the month when it's easier to handle bits of information, and times of the month when it might not be. So all of the things. But thinking about kind of what might be affecting our buckets kind of at that time, and kind of sometimes being a bit kinder to ourselves about why is it overflown today? Is there anything else that I could have avoided kind of going into that today? So then we'll just have another pause again to think about what are your triggers. But I'm just thinking there, Ben, shall we also have a quick sort of break as well for people to fill up
definitely. Have a 5-minute break if people want to go to the toilet and fill up the drinks or anything.
Break as well.
And then think about those triggers too.
Yeah.
Perfect. Right, I've got a clock on for 5 minutes if anybody wants to have a move around, and actually we'll do 3 minutes, get back in your seats in 3 minutes, and then we're going to do a little bit of blood flowing, get some squats and some stretches in for 2 minutes.
Is that 3 minutes for a toilet break and to fill up a drink?
3 minutes for a toilet break and fill up a drink and write down your triggers, and then I'm going to get some blood pumping with some squats and some little stretches quickly for 2 minutes. You've been sitting down far too long. Right, off you go. 3 minutes.
Are you serious?
Right, we'll wait for Diane, Sam, and Amanda and Phil, and then we'll get cracking. Right, everybody get about your seats. I want 5 squats, just normal body weight squats, and then I want 10 spinal rotations, getting your head forward and the line of your hands. So 5 squats and then 10 spinal rotations. Let's get them going. Get the blood pumping. Bit of the juices flowing. Get some blood pumping into the brain, ready for this. 5 squats, 10 spinal rotations, and then you can have your seat. Good stuff. Susan, you won.
Yeah. Yeah, we're just still doing the exercises now. You're late now.
Right. Everyone ready to rock? Back on, Nicola. Good stuff. Cheers.
Okay. So then what are your triggers? So then once we kind of know what are the signs that we might be getting overwhelmed, our buckets overflowing, and we've got kind of some idea of the sorts of things that might set that off, so that we can work out whether we've got any control over what's happening kind of at that time to manage that, or just recognize that it's likely to be those things that are causing it, maybe, so we can be a bit kinder to ourselves about it when it happens. Then kind of what can you kind of do to deal with it? So I suppose the first bit I've kind of focused on is what's happening when it's kind of immediately going on. So it's already the bucket is overflowing right now, and the kind of principles are about trying to give that control center a break. So it's kind of gone onto its battery low mode, and then it's about to kind of completely shut down and malfunction. So we need to kind of take a bit of pressure off that bit of the brain there. So the principles are kind of thinking, well, is there any way we can kind of reduce some of the information that's kind of going into that control center? Can we use different bits of the brain so it takes a bit of pressure off using that, or use some of the other systems in the body called the soothe system and the drive system, rather than just our threat system? And I'll come on to those. So the drive, threat and soothe system kind of theory is from a guy called Paul Gilbert, and he's got quite a few talks on YouTube and things, and talks about something called compassion focused therapy. But he, as well as doing those 3 bits of the brain, also kind of talks about 3 sort of systems in balance in the body. So as I've kind of alluded to, our threat system is really important because that's what's keeping us safe, and so that's what's kind of recognizing what are risks that are going on in our world, and how do we kind of adapt and keep ourselves kind of safe and away from them, and that's running on our kind of sympathetic nervous system and our adrenaline. But we need to balance that out with things like our drive system, and our drive is then going to be when you're going towards goals and passions and things that you want to do. And he talks about this system working on some of our brain chemicals of things like dopamine. So that's kind of like really important in kind of our reward system. It comes up in, oh gosh, everything from like your sugar rush to kind of gambling to getting that hit when you've scored a goal. but we know that little wins that you can kind of do every day kind of give us a bit of a dopamine hit. So if we can think about how we can activate that drive system kind of on a regular basis, that's one of the bits that can kind of keep it in balance. I suppose things like when we're setting ourselves kind of challenges kind of at sport, and you kind of achieve those, you get that dopamine hit of a feel-good feeling. There's other sorts of other endorphins and things that we're going to get from exercise, but sometimes when we might achieve things at work or get a compliment and things like that, it could be activating that kind of drive system. And then the third bit is our soothe system, and that we think kind of works with elements of the body like our parasympathetic and our also things like oxytocin, and that's a chemical that a hormone that's produced when we have babies, and it's part of like the bonding reaction that we have with them. And we also are supposed to kind of release it when we stroke pets and we're kind of close and we're connected with other people. So one of the really difficult things about the whole kind of COVID outbreak is the lack of physical contact a lot of people have with other people. So trying to maintain something akin to that over things like the computer is not quite the same as being in real life, but actually seeing people's faces and reactions is still better than just being over the telephone. So touch is something that can kind of emit that, but also kind of other acts of kindness again that other people might have towards you kind of might release those kind of feel good things. And he talks about acts of self-kindness, so when you're kind of indulging yourself in having a nice bath or putting on kind of like a nice body lotion and things like that might make you kind of activate your soothe system. And then also things like particular breathing techniques. So I don't know if anybody does do things like yogic breathing, but again, I think there's a sort of increasing kind of body of even more kind of scientific research about some of that breathing, that when we are slowing that down, we can improve our the heart rate variability that we've got, which is kind of like a balance between our sympathetic system and our parasympathetic nervous system. So that kind of keeps us kind of healthy and kind of responsive. So being able to kind of control and slow that breathing down and kind of slow down that heart rate when we're doing that sort of yoga breathing helps to balance out that threat system as well. So I suppose sort of thinking back to those things of like giving the control center a break, reducing that information, using a different part of the brain and activating those soothe system or drive systems. I mean, some kind of ideas for when things are in the heat of the moment. Quite often we'll do a lot of these things quite naturally, but retreating to somewhere quiet if we're wanting to kind of get away from the sensory overload that's happening. And it's quite natural for us to want to go towards things that might be familiar to us. So that could be anything from of wanting to put on your favorite kind of feeling of like favorite pajamas, or put on like a piece of music that you really like, or have your favorite meal. We'll retreat back to kind of what is kind of those kind of home comforts for us. And we know things like this that happen with children, don't they? When they're a bit anxious, they want to watch their favorite film or whatever kind of over and over again, or sleep with their favorite teddy. But we retreat to kind of something that feels kind of familiar to us. Then kind of when we're trying to think about using a different bit of the brain, so Amy Bran, who has written the book where a lot of the kind of neuroscience of this came from, I mean, she talks about needing to do at least 15 minutes of something different to give the brain a rest. Now, when we're working particularly, say, with people who've got quite extreme levels of distress in our sort of services, we look at kind of an arousal peak. And we know that when you're really, really het up and all adrenaline has been released out of your body, it takes about 90 minutes for it to kind of completely sort of disperse. So 15 minutes to doing something different might be all right if you're kind of just getting kind of a bit kind of worked up and need to have a break. But if it's kind of a severe meltdown level of kind of overwhelm, just bearing in mind kind of like how long it takes the body to kind of disperse that reaction to kind of go back to not having it circulating at those high levels around your system. And because it's sort of comes as a kind of graph, that as it's kind of coming down, all of the important thing is to kind of avoid like reactivating that arousal cycle. So as it's kind of coming down, what you don't want is something else stressing you out while you're still kind of coming down, because then you're going to go right back up to your peak again. So thinking about, right, I need a good chunk of time out before somebody else comes and puts like another demand on me, before I've got right down to that baseline level again, because otherwise it could be like the entire day that you're just peaking and peaking and peaking, or maybe into the next day as well. So think about, it might take longer than you kind of first expected. So I put on there, pets and connection. But first, people might or might not want to be kind of around others because they're retreating to the quiet, but sometimes just having some sort of connection of sitting by somebody, so they might not even have to say anything, but having that kind of physical contact might be something that then releases that oxytocin and helps you calm down. Talks about the breathing. It might be doing something like movement. So again, you're not thinking. Again, many of us might have felt the need for going and having a good old walk outside, to kind of shift into a different environment, to get kind of your body moving around. So you're kind of using other bits of your motor cortex rather than just that prefrontal cortex that's going on. And then again, other parts of your brain that might be involved with those goal-directed behaviors. So sometimes doing things where there might be, again, like a mini target at it. So it sounds like really silly, but even throwing things into a bin to see kind of if you make it, or don't we sometimes kind of distract ourselves with like games on our phone because they're kind of things that are going to give us kind of like that reward buzz. Again, we don't want to be doing it kind of all of the time, but it might be a distracting activity from the one that we were doing, where we were trying to do all that decision making. Creative bits of the brain, so balancing it out with something else that's going to get you kind of thinking in a completely different way. That can sometimes be quite difficult to shift, again, if you're really in the peak of the moment. So it might be a bit more to think about when we think about preventing overwhelm. And sometimes like just repetitive activities where we're not, again, really making decisions. So I think somebody talked about kind of like just sort of working, but it might be in that kind of, I'm going to just go and clean the bathroom kind of activity, something you don't really need to kind of think about in a great deal of kind of complex decision making way, but you can just kind of do. So they might be things kind of in the kind of heat of the moment to think about, and you might have some more ideas about, or what are things that you do that seem to be activating different sorts of the brain. But then we'll come on to then what else might prevent getting to that level as well in itself. So obviously, those are kind of some more first aid things for it's all gone wrong, but how do we not get to that point, or try and do some things that might prevent that? So priming is kind of again, another sort of psychological concept, but the idea behind this is that we kind of sort of set ourselves up for the day. So if we're going to kind of get our mind into a kind of a bias for thinking, if we start the day right, we might have more of a chance of having the rest of the day kind of going right. So rather than kind of waking up where we've missed the alarm and then we've had a bad hair day and then got caught in traffic, and by the time you arrive at work, kind of everything's kind of just going wrong. Think about what else could you kind of place in your kind of routine from like the minute that you've woken up that starts to kind of give you the messages back that this is a good day, you're a great person, all is going well. And again, probably we naturally do some of those things, don't we, of thinking like, I feel great when I've done exercise first thing in the morning, because that's giving myself kind of feedback that I've achieved something, or I'm starting to now feel good about this. If you've had a good breakfast, if you feel like you've woken up with enough time, that you've said nice things to your loved ones. So what could you like potentially put in that routine? What music might you be playing kind of first thing in the morning that gets you going for the rest of the day? What could you be doing to set yourself up? Then the next thing, I don't know if people have probably heard about before, but it's something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this was developed kind of like years ago by a guy called Maslow, and he talked about it as a sort of a pyramid, and the things that you kind of need to have in place at the bottom of the pyramid before you can kind of get to the things at the top. So like right at the bottom are meeting your kind of very basic physiological needs, and they're things like getting enough kind of like light, food, sleep, warmth. And I suppose it's amazing how often we're not kind of thinking about how we do like the basics. So we're trying to kind of think about things kind of much further up the pyramid of how we're going to make ourselves into these amazing kind of human beings, but not thinking about what kind of scaffolding needs to be at the bottom to kind of make ourselves feel safe. So kind of, have we addressed our most basic needs, of having a good, decent meals in the day? Are we made sure that we're kind of got enough sleep at night? Are we really addressing those? Then coming back to the kind of distraction kind of idea again. So I suppose not just kind of external distractions, but again, it sort of talks about how you can actually develop the skill of kind of focus in your mind. And don't do it a lot, but how by practicing some things like meditation, or just being able to focus on an activity that you're doing in what's a kind of a mindful way, which is essentially just really noticing kind of every aspect about what you're doing for kind of short periods of time, can train again bits of your brain like that insula to work kind of even better. So could there be other ways that you could think of that you could help yourself focus for periods of the day, that helps kind of build that up so you can take it into more areas of your life? I mean, I know I'm not kind of very good at this in lots of places. I can't even count in the sessions I'm having kind of with exercises, but sometimes I might use things like a timer to say, right, I'm going to have 5 minutes just working on this piece of writing that I've got to do, and try and remove other distractions. Or could it be that I'm putting on some headphones just with some white noise that's going on that helps me to kind of get into that pattern, and then thinking about building on that. Predictability. So obviously, we're in the time of COVID again. It's been really hard to predict other things that are going on in the rest of the world. So coming back again to that idea of like, what is within your zone of control, or kind of even potentially influence, of how can you make your life as predictable as possible. And so when there are more stresses going on, it's more helpful to have more routine and predictability that's happening. And so kind of, are there other ways that you could make things like timetables that happen? I suppose, things like the schedules that you've got, then with like the sessions of I'm going to carry on with this kind of routine of exercise, and this routine of like walking the dog, or this routine of like what I do in my day, or what meals I have or what things I get from the shop. So the more predictable they are, the easier it is for your kind of brain to manage. Are there any other kind of opportunities to kind of reduce conflict or those feelings of unfairness? Again, probably see quite a lot kind of hammered on about the Royal College of Psychiatrists and things like social media and kind of, is it always helpful? And I suppose it's a bit like wine, isn't it? It's kind of like managing that and, you know, recognizing when there might be times when you're ending up using it for kind of comparison with people in other situations, or kind of getting into conflict, and when is that perhaps starting to overwhelm you a bit much and you need to avoid it. Where can we reduce the choice and options? So I kind of touched on like people like Mark Zuckerberg, like having a uniform for the day rather than going and looking at a kind of massive wardrobe to kind of decide what outfit he's going to pick out. But it could be that with you know, things like a menu plan that's already kind of in place, rather than thinking what shall I have for tea, could help, you know, reduce that. Having a time that you wake up rather than what time will I wake up kind of is another way of like reducing decision making, because it's already there. You know, what else can be just automated for you so that you're not having to think about it, it's just gonna happen. And then prioritizing. So you know, getting things down kind of on paper and lists can be a lot better than having them going round in your head. But then working out what are the most important things. So if it's kind of a long list that's there, maybe what are the 3 most important tasks that you've got to get done, and thinking of how your brain is going to run out of energy and run out of that decision making ability. When might you kind of try and plan to do those? Is it going to be when you're tired and hungry and run out of all of that mental effort, or are you going to do those most important things when it's going to be most lively and full of capacity, that could be earlier on in the day for you? And then again, so as being in the present. So how can you reduce the time that you might spend in past memories that might not be as helpful, or in future kind of imaginings that might not be as helpful? I mean, some of those things might be great. They might be like looking to the future and things that are going to be brilliant and happy, and some of the past things might be lovely memories, but sometimes they're not. And how can you kind of tell yourself that perhaps what is going on now is the place to focus on? Easier said than done though. So again, that's I think a point to just pause again. So I think if we should we have another 3 minutes then, just for jotting some ideas down from what I've said there. Yep. To think about what you could put down in. So in that question 6, what could you be doing, just for some ideas for yourself in that kind of answer?
Brilliant. Pop 3 minutes on the clock. Off we go.
And then we'll come back to share some kind of thoughts about what people might be going to do.
Brilliant.
Ideas, yeah. Thank you. So we're coming now towards the wrapping up. So just to go back over kind of what were some of the things that people had said about getting what they wanted out of this. So we touched on, like, when we're thinking about how can you help others, and you'd said, Ben, about like understanding a bit more about how you might be asking questions of people or thinking about how you help them. So I suppose this gives you a few different kind of tools and frameworks to think about, some analogies, both for yourself, but also if somebody that you know is experiencing some stress, a few pointers of ways that you could help them talk about what that is feeling like for them. Hopefully everybody else who talks about, you know, what is within our control and what isn't, and we've again obviously touched on what are the things that we can do something about. So there are lots of things that we can't change at the moment, but there are maybe a few small changes that we could change to our days, to our thoughts, to our actions that we do that might help a little bit with the holes that are in the bottom of that bucket at the moment. I suppose in terms of kind of keeping a perspective on everything else that's going on at the moment, it is very hard because we're going to be constantly doing that adaptation, and we don't know a lot of the answers kind of about the future. But again, I suppose what you can be doing and trying to make more predictable and trying to kind of keep within your control could be one way to address that. And how do you kind of cope with like negative feelings and thoughts? Again, recognizing that they're happening, but it can be very, very difficult. The more you're trying not to have them, the more they can sometimes then be noticed. So I suppose from a coaching perspective, it's how can you kind of train yourself to turn that into a different thought that you can use to replace it with, rather than to just tell yourself not to have it. And I suppose from some of the things today, how can you avoid using that thinking bit of the brain all of the time? Could there be a different bit that you're using that's maybe the creative bits, the movement bit, the goal-directed bit, that's taking a bit of pressure off of the thinking? It won't be like working 100% of the time, but might be just small changes that build up into a different way of looking at things. But I wondered after doing that this evening, whether people had other questions or things that they would like to reflect upon with the rest of the group.
So if anybody wants to particularly ask a question, it doesn't have to be anything that we've covered there, like Nicola said.
Yeah, so just thank you very much for everybody participating with that, because that's what's made it a really enjoyable session for me. There's a few other reading and references, but as John was pointing out about Stephen Covey as well, is another great book to look at, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
You pop these in the group, please, Nicola. You know, these references, is it possible if you pop them in as just a comment in the Facebook group, please?
Yeah.
With that as well, the one that John mentioned, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I shall do that. Yes, and if there's other things that are along the theme of mental health, or things to do with the mind and coaching that you think would be really valuable to have any future sessions on or anything, I'm happy to